Ben Twomey. I'm Policing TV's newest presenter, and I'm thrilled today to have joining us Neil Woods, who is a former police officer and undercover drugs operative, and he's now a leading member of the international drug policy reform movement. Neil's actually the founder of LEAP UK, Law Enforcement Action Partnership, and the chair of LEAP Europe, so really leading the international agenda when it comes to drug policy reform. Hi, Neil. Welcome.
Hey, Ben. It's good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too. Thanks so much for joining me for this first interview that I'm doing. Had to start with you because your journey is just so fascinating and quite different to what a lot of former police officers might be able to talk about. Did you ever imagine when you were a drugs policy, when you were enforcing drugs policy, I suppose, when you were a drugs operative, did you ever imagine that your career would turn out with you trying to lead the international change that would end the war on drugs?
No, God, no, not at all. When I started in covert drugs policing, I was a wholehearted believer in that cause, really, in that I felt quite privileged to be able to work catching drug dealers and seeing them really as the scourge of our communities and being the criminals, the ones to catch. So no, I was completely invested in the whole drugs prohibition thing, as many cops are.
And when you found that you were beginning to realise that in your words this was causing immense harm to people, did you find that you were alone in reaching those conclusions, or what was it that caused you to change your mind?
Well, it was certainly a much lonelier place then. Now, of course, I speak to cops all over the place, and that I doubt you'll find a single cop who believes we can win this war on drugs, or in fact that there's any benefit to current drugs policing. But it was a bit lonelier then. Well, I suppose considering how much covert drugs work I did, I was a bit slow on the uptake, really, because I was very resistant to the evidence before my eyes. Right, I could see that there wasn't any tangible benefits to the work that I did, but the trouble is, you sort of get hooked on catching the gangster at the end of the operation, right? You just want to keep catching those criminals, and that just seems justification for all of the expenditure, all of the effort, all of those resources, and also all of the harm that's been caused along the way to the vulnerable people who are caught in the crossfire. So it took me a long time, really, to face up to the evidence before my eyes that actually every time that drug dealer, that was caught, every time a gang was caught that was supplying the heroin in a quarter of a city or whatever, it didn't have any benefit at all. It didn't. In fact, quite often, as most cops who pay attention to this will agree, it actually increased violence, because if you create a gap in the market size stays the same. Absolutely. You're not reducing the size of that market by any police activity, but you are changing the shape of that market. And in one way, that changing shape means that you create an opportunity, and that opportunity is fought over by two or more other actors. So you have localized increase in violence. You also have suit organized crime very well, because organized crime want you to get rid of rivals. That in terms of a few steps up from the street, police activity suits organised crime very well indeed. In fact, you can even say that the drugs policing sharpens the sword of organised crime. It makes organised crime more efficient, more ruthless, because that market never shrinks. So there's always someone trading in that marketplace. This is supply and demand. It's the power of economics. Policing cannot impact on that, but it can change the behaviour of those operating within that marketplace. So if you create a situation where organised crime need to react against the threat of police informants, or they need to react against the threat of a community speaking to the police about them, they will be more ruthless and more violent to prevent that happening. So this is the kind of thing that we need to be studying as police. We need to be zooming out and being really clear-eyed and thinking very carefully about this as to what are the actual benefits, what are the actual impacts of drugs policing in our society.
So from that, are you really suggesting that if the police did nothing about drugs, that it would actually be better, or at least not quite so bad in terms of the way that drugs are causing harms at the moment?
Well, it would make no difference to the size of the market. It would make no difference to the size of the customer base. It would make no difference at all to the quantity of drugs that were being sold, imported, and consumed. It would make no difference at all whether we policed it or not. What policing does is it makes the market more violent, because if you threaten people with jail, you threaten people with policing, you threaten people, they will protect themselves in any way they can. Now, I'm not. Many cops who are listening to this will start objecting, and they might even be shouting at the screen that am I suggesting there's no benefit to policing at all? No, that's not what I'm suggesting. It's very important to separate drugs policing from every other type of policing here. It's very, very important, because any good cop will tell you that if you catch a house burglar in a community, you do that job, you do the groundwork, and you catch that burglar, burglaries will go down in that community, because there are a limited number of people who are willing to commit that crime and have the skills to do it. If you catch a drug dealer in a community, crime doesn't go down. It doesn't. It actually goes up. It's more likely to go up, because you have that sort of knock-on effect of violence which follows disrupting that marketplace. There is a difference. You don't have the same powers of supply and demand running a trade like burglary. Of course, burglary is impacted by the drug market, because problematic heroin and crack cocaine users are often the people who are committing those crimes. But again, that's a failure of drug policy, because if you look after those people with a health response, they don't need to commit the crime. But that's not a policing solution, that's a health and public health solution. So am I suggesting that it would be better if we actually didn't do anything? In one way, yes, except that ignoring it completely without a change in regulations and a change in legislation would mean that the public nuisance of drug dealing would be more overt. Because if you suddenly abandoned it completely and said you can do what you want, you can do a free-for-all, then the public nuisance associated with the trade would be incredibly overt, because people would be injecting in even more overt places. So what we need, or what us activists say that we need, and the evidence backs us up, is that we need regulatory control. We need regulatory control, and that doesn't mean criminalising people. It means taking care of people. It means making legislative decisions about where people can consume drugs, where they get their drugs, who manufactures them, who they can be sold to. So all of these things are about protecting young people. They're about protecting the public. It's about reducing the public nuisance. It's about all of those things, because at the moment there is no control. It's the Wild West. Drug prohibition is the surrendering of control to market forces. It's created the ultimate unregulated market.
So just to think about that control for a moment, and the way that you say that police know that this isn't working, and you wouldn't find a police officer who would think that you can win the war on drugs. And maybe that's true. If anyone's watching this and thinking that they could win the war on drugs, then please do comment so we can start the debate about that. But if it's so obvious that the police can't control this and that attempts to do so are causing more harm than good, then what's holding up the change, in your view, that's needed?
Well, cops do as they're told, right? I mean, they don't decide the law. The laws are decided above cops' pay grade. So police will always do the best job they can with the instructions they've been given. So that is true to an extent. However, there are things that the police can do and are doing very well in the UK, and particularly in the UK, and that is to take pragmatic responses which can improve the situation. So, for example, diversion schemes, so that young people don't get dragged into criminality and get a criminal record for possession of drugs. There's many police services in the UK have got diversion schemes. Evidence backs them up. It frees up police resources. It doesn't criminalise young people. It keeps people away from the criminal justice system. Brilliant. But you can also deprioritize, like they have in Durham and elsewhere, where you do not go out and seek young people to arrest them for cannabis. You don't go kicking doors in to a medical cannabis user who's growing some plants in their spare bedroom. You just leave it alone. What's the point in prioritizing finite resources that could be used elsewhere in policing? Police leadership in this country are making those decisions in a much more intelligent way than most other nations. So we've got this weird thing in the UK that the police leadership is in places so good on this topic, but that's in spite of the politics. And in other countries, the politics is ahead of the police, and actually the police are a barrier to those reforms. So we have this really peculiar situation in the UK where actually the smartest people on this topic are the cops in many regards.
That's really interesting, the international view you've got of this. Just want to talk briefly about your book, your first book, in fact, Good Cop, Bad War. I was wondering if you could talk us through that title a little bit, because the idea of a good cop who is kicking down that door that you're talking about, arresting people, young people potentially, for cannabis possession, let's say. How do you square that with the idea that it's fundamentally causing harm?
Well, look, the cops would do as they're told, right? And they do a good job working very, very hard. But the problem is, in my case, in the case of many, many others and many people that I know, doing that job as best as you can, but with a bad law, with a bad system, is causing harm. It's not just causing harm to individuals that we come across. It also causes harm to the police. So I'm diagnosed with complex PTSD and moral injury, which is two separate conditions. Moral injury is very similar to PTSD, but it comes from the idea that we can harm ourselves by causing harm to others. It was first diagnosed in Vietnam veterans returning from the Vietnam War. Now, there's many instances where I knew I was causing harm to people, but I carried on going because it was what I was instructed to do. But also, at the end of the job, you catch the gangster, right? You catch the bad guy. But I've caused such harm to individuals. One, for example, I befriended, and he thought I was my one friend in the world. The one person finally found someone he could talk to and confide in. But when he found out at the end of the operation that I was actually a cop, he ended up being suicidal in police cell. And he said that he was someone who was using heroin to self-medicate for childhood trauma, like almost all problematic heroin users are. And he'd finally found someone who could listen to him. But that was me using my skills to emotionally manipulate him to make him do what I wanted. Now, that instance and many, many others like it have caused harm to me, and it's part of my complex set of mental health symptoms. So that bad war is not only causing harm to vulnerable people who need help, who need a health response, not a policing response. It's causing harm to society because organised crime is becoming more and more ruthless in response to the hard work that cops do. It's also causing harm to individual police, and it's causing harm to policing as a whole, because police have to be part of the community. We have to be accountable to the community. But that community should include people who use drugs, people who use cannabis recreationally, people who use cannabis medicinally, and most importantly, those vulnerable people who are using drugs problematically because they've got trauma. We have a responsibility to them as well, and that responsibility does not include criminalising them. So this is damaging policing as a whole. So there are so many reasons why police officers and police leaders should advocate for drug law reform. Okay, we have to do as we're told. That's what the law says. But we can be honest about the impacts to try and change things politically.
Well, this is my next question, Neil, actually. When you're thinking about the way in which a police officer might be doing as they're told, and they might feel like they are hearing everything you say, they get it completely, they may even feel some of the same guilt about the outcomes of what they're doing. But do you have any sympathy for those people working in policing right now who feel that they're not able to speak up, or if they did, they would be putting themselves in a position that wouldn't be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely, of course. When I tried to speak about this with people, I got all sorts of hostility. And I mean, some people agreed with me, but it was still really difficult. And some cops have more difficulty than others. It's harder for some than others to speak out because of the situation they're in, the dynamics of their team. If you're stuck in a team of diehard prohibitionists, kick the doors in cops, it's harder for you to start talking about your doubts, isn't it? But what I will say is that both in the UK and many countries around the world, because Leap's in many, many countries, we're very active and growing across Europe. It is becoming easier, and has become easier, certainly since I published Good Cop, Bad War, to speak out. It is in many places. And what helps with that is that a lot of police leaders are actually looking at this seriously. They're looking at the impact on the mental health of their troops, and they're looking at what actually reduces crime. Because, we spend so much time chasing our tails as cops because of the problematic heroin market, for example. But if we go back to the British system and prescribe heroin to people who use it problematically, that reduces this massive strain on policing because you reduce crime. And we know this. We know this from the evidence of the British system. We know from the evidence of what they do in Switzerland and Netherlands, but also recently in the UK in Cleveland, where a massive crime reduction was caused by the Police and Crime Commissioner actually investing in heroin-assisted treatment using policing money. And you got policing outcomes, a reduction in crime.
And where is the UK on this overall? You see the picture across Europe where you work. You're also on the board of Law Enforcement Action Partnership in the US. Where's the UK fit compared to other countries across the world?
Well, politically, in terms of national politics, we are way behind most of the rich nations. In fact, the only country that's worse than us for our drug policy is Sweden. And you can see that play out in the extreme violence, the murders, the open warfare using bombs that's going on in Sweden. And that's because they have the toughest drug policy in Europe. They'll even prosecute people on a blood test. So that creates a very hostile environment, which encourages violence in order to be the dominant force in the streets. So we're not as bad as Sweden, but we are way worse than most European countries in terms of national politics. But having said that, our police service is way ahead of anywhere. We're way ahead of France, way ahead of most places, really. The only place that's maybe better than us at the moment is in the Netherlands, but they have the benefit of having a better drug policy. So the UK really is standing out. If you look at the stance of Police Scotland, for example, how they, for a point of principle, as much as the health need, decided that every single cop was going to carry naloxone. And the police leadership made that happen, despite the Police Federation initially actually being against it and actually trying to picket the training for it. But now, the cops on the street who have to deal with drug deaths, I've seen interviews with loads of them, and they're really happy about this. And one interview with a cop really stands out for me because he said, I was sick of giving death messages for drug overdoses. Now I've got this yellow box, I can potentially save some life. And he actually did save a life. He actually used his naloxone and saved a life. And that is more meaningful and better for his mental health than constantly giving death messages to grieving families. So, the leadership in the UK, we can be really proud of the way that British cops and British police leadership are taking the lead on this in a way that other countries, that just doesn't happen.
That's fascinating to hear the international perspective there. Just thinking about the change that you need. So you're asking police leaders to do more of what you're saying, the local areas that are leading the way, but also you're relying on politicians to change the way in which you actually begin to regulate drugs as well that are currently criminalized. That change from a political perspective seems a long way off compared to those local changes. I'm going to ask you a question now that you might want to hedge, but let's see if we can get it on the record anyway. How long do you think it will be before the UK sees a properly regulated market for drugs, and then all of the changes that you'd want to see that come from that?
Well, it depends on the drugs, of course, because different drugs bring different problems and different regulatory requirements, and we should regulate each drug according to its relative risks and the needs of society. Heroin is the easiest drug to regulate because you won't even need any change in law. You just need to go back to the prescription model where doctors can prescribe to those people who use it problematically. You do that and you dramatically reduce crime. 80% of the market that creates county lines is heroin. So you completely undermine the county lines child exploitation system by prescribing heroin. That you don't need a law change for this. Hopefully, whichever new government comes in, myself and many other drug law reform activists will be talking to as many politicians who will listen. And I'm hoping that the evidence is going to be so huge for that move that we can have that within 3 or 4 years of the next new government.
Does this mean that we've got heroin cafes on the way, for example?
No, I mean, heroin, you do it according to relative risks, which for heroin, you mean you have it as a strict medical model. Now, the strict medical model that's in the Orange Book for drug treatment service providers is very strict. I want it less strict than that. I want actually some take-home provision so that you get as many people as possible involved in it. But no, it's a very strictly controlled. It's never going to be for sale. It'd be more modelled on the Swiss model, or based on the Swiss model, because they haven't got a heroin problem anymore. The opioid deaths that's coming from the new synthetic opioids, that's just not going to happen in Switzerland because they took control of their heroin market by prescribing heroin back in 1994. They've got hardly any people who use heroin anymore because they took control. So we need to look at that evidence. In terms of the other drugs, I would hope that we would have a legal regulated cannabis market within 6 years. That's my hope. Germany's just gone legal. That will have an influence. The UK could actually set up a legal regulated business which has bigger financial benefits than that of Germany because we don't have the same rules that they have as the EU. So that may be the singular benefit of Brexit, but let's not go there, I suppose. In terms of the other drugs, the Netherlands is seriously politically considering the legal regulation of MDMA at the moment. And what will speed up that process is that the legal therapeutic use of MDMA for treatment of PTSD is about to go legal in the United States. That will come. That will be coming in Europe. And actually, one of the things that we're working on very hard at Leap Europe is to argue that when we get MDMA therapy, police should be at the front of the queue because there's a mental health crisis in policing, and it's police that need these treatments. So that's another cry out to police leaders. Work with me, work with Leap Europe to advocate for police getting access to the best possible treatment for their mental health problem.
Well, thank you so much, Neil. You had it here first then that we're going to have a regulated market if Neil's hopes come true of recreational cannabis within the next 6 years, of heroin in a medical setting in the next few years, and possibly looking at MDMA as well. If you agree with that and you're watching, then let us know. If you think that's a good thing or a bad thing that may be coming down the line, then let us know too. But the key message here, I think, from Neil is that drugs policing has to stop, and you can only do that through a regulated model. So it's certainly going to spark a debate on policing TV. I would encourage people to have a look at, I've got it just here, Good Cop, Bad War, which is Neil's first book, all about his journey as a undercover drugs operative, and then Drug Wars as well, which Neil put together on more of a comprehensive history of drugs policing in the UK as well. I didn't want to go into fan mode there, but I did do my research before this interview to make sure that we're talking from the same hymn sheet as well. So thanks so much, Neil. Really appreciate your time. And thank you to everyone that's watched today. Everyone, please do get involved, as I say, on the conversation with Policing TV. Thanks a lot.
Good to see you, Ben. Bye-bye.